Well, welcome back to the Comic Book Historians Podcast. I'm Alex Grand, here with a special guest, Jesse Simon, the grandson of famous Captain America creator Joe Simon. Jesse is talking about his grandpa Joe, as well as the new Simon family comic book, ShieldMaster. Jesse, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm good. It's nice to finally put a face to the messages, a voice to the messages. First, let's talk a little bit about your family's comic ShieldMaster. A couple issues have come out. They've been funded through Kickstarter. The first two issues have been funded and they've been released. I have my copies. I love them. And there is a story arc that goes from issues 3 through 10, where you're the primary writer. From what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, your dad originated this character and Joe Simon also had some involvement with that character. Is that right?
My father is Jim Simon, and in 1998, he created the character called ShieldMaster. And he wrote a movie treatment and plot and brought it to my grandfather. Now, the two of them had their own company together called Crestwood 2. They did a book called The Comic Book Makers together, which was very popular.
Yeah, I read that. I loved it. That was great.
Yeah, it was the first time somebody from the Golden Age was really talking about it. So they did that together. They've always been very close. My father's always worked with my grandfather back in the 70s at DC, Prez, Brother Power. Some of those things he had a hand in, gave ideas. So he goes to my grandfather and Joe Simon. He says, I have this idea, and he pitches it to him. And Joe, if you didn't know Joe, or even if you did, when you were talking to him about comics and ideas for comics, artwork, he was very critical. He was an editor. You know, he would say, this is no good, that needs improving. But for some reason, even shocked my father a little bit, he really liked ShieldMaster.
Oh, cool.
And he got to work and he did the prototype art. My father said, I like that. I don't really like that. Change that. Well, both of them are not that easy to deal with. I guess it runs in the family. So my grandfather, he did the prototype art to ShieldMaster. He actually framed it, put it in his living room, a copy. He did a few, did some unfinished sketches, which I'll get to why that's important in going forward. It actually hung in his living room. My father had a full-time job, didn't do comics. He wanted to. He had some interest, but Joe said, it's not a good medium. Don't get into it.
And what does your dad do?
My father's retired. He used to work for the city of New York, Department of Children's Services. So he had this full-time job. He wasn't really able to do ShieldMaster. He did some movie treatments here and there, wrote some books, The Monster Channel, did the kids' book, Jack and Leo the Blue Elephant, some joke books, had a #1 bestseller, the King Kong joke book. He did manage to get a graphic novel done of ShieldMaster. This whole time growing up, I've always heard about my grandfather's creations and how could you not? I was literally born into it. But I always heard of ShieldMaster, and I never knew much about it. And as I grew up, it was something different. My father created it. So I took it and I took that graphic novel. I split it in half, issues 1 and 2, and I got artists to do covers like Bob Layden and David Mack.
Yeah,
Steve
I love the covers. They're great.
I worked very closely with the artists. At times I even laid out the cover, or I'd tell them change this, change that. Again, the editor, difficult being a Simon. And some I was very, hands off with, like Bob Layden. I left him alone, and he produced a gorgeous cover. It was pretty successful. I really came out of left field with this project.
So the interiors by ReedMan for issues 1 and 2, are those just from the graphic novel, basically? Is that right?
Correct.
Oh, okay. So ReedMan did those before. What year was that?
2012.
Okay, I gotcha.
Joe saw some of ShieldMaster getting done, and he quite liked ReedMan's stuff. He thought it was very interesting, very different. So I took that work, I rewrote the story, rescripted it. My father used some of the edits, didn't use it all. So issues 1 and 2, what is really my fingerprints is the covers.
Yeah.
The interiors is really my father's and ReedMan's.
That's right.
Going forward with issue 3, I have a new interior artist. ReedMan's still with us doing the colors, but I have a new interior artist. I've laid out the art. I'm very hands-on, again, with the covers as well, more than some with others. Going forward, this is a new creative team. My father's also, doing some work on it, but, not as heavily. And yeah, it's a very unique thing to have 3 generations of one family all involved, all have their hand in something. Some have bigger hands than others, but still, it's the only other comparison I could think of is the Kuberts. Joe Kubert Andy and his daughter Emma. 3 generations. You look at the Ramirez, they got 2 generations, something that I think is very interesting, and the fans have quite enjoyed.
It reminded me of some of the Silver Age stuff I've read. Like, it reminded me a bit of The Fly, where there's like an extra dimensional source of power for the Fly character in that first issue. In this, it's 4 friends. They find these transdimensional shield objects that empower them. What's interesting is I think in the first issue, where one of them holds up a Life of Private Strong issue, which I thought was cool to see that cover, because I was like, I know that cover. Then I think the second issue, there's a poster of Joe Simon's Superheroes cover on the wall, or on a closet door or something. And so I liked it. I felt like it's continuing the Simon tradition of superheroes. Am I correct in thinking of it that way?
In a way, my father, he writes, and Joe was a writer too, and Joe was an artist and all these other things. The misconception that Joe only did art, or even worse, only did business. My father's a writer, but he is very sophisticated. He writes novels. And when he was writing this, he wanted little Easter eggs here and there.
Yeah.
And one of them being, he put in the little comic book of Double Life of Private Strong, issue #1. Jess Stevens, the main character, they're 4 friends, but the main character is a fan of comics. His friends give him a birthday present, and it's that comic book. And my father was 9 when that comic book came out. So he remembers that comic as a kid. He remembers the Fighting American and Bullseye and all these other comics. And so those are the little Easter eggs throughout, as well as ReedMan put in that Simon-Kirby Superheroes cover on the wall, which I like as well. I'm going to keep up with those Easter eggs throughout. And another thing that most people did not catch is that there's actually a few Simon and Kirby swipes in the book. Takes some poses and redraws them and implements them. And so much so that my father didn't even realize for some of them. I was reading it and I said, look at this, that's Joe's art, that's, and he didn't even realize. So it's fun things throughout that keep the readers, engaged, as well as has that unique aspect that no other book has.
Jess Stevens, is that basically Jesse Simon?
What happened was, when he created ShieldMaster, he didn't have a name for the character. Years later, when he was doing the graphic novel, I was already born, because ShieldMaster was created before I was born.
What year were you born?
03.
03.
Yeah. So when he needed a name for the character, he said, well, the first name, instead of Jesse, I'll do Jess. And as the last name, as a tribute to his father's character, Steve Rogers, he did Stevens.
I see. So that's what that is.
And that's how the name came about. Another little Easter egg.
The Drummond guy, his face was scarred and bandaged in that explosion, and he's vowing revenge, and that had a little bit of a Doctor Doom vibe to it. Is that was that intentional, or just more of a story device?
I can't say. My father grew up reading Joe stuff.
Yeah.
And he grew up reading the Fighting American, and the Fighting American had those really weird villains. The Fly and Private Strong, grew up reading those. So, I think subconsciously some of that stuff went over. But I'll tell you this, my father did not really follow comics. When Avengers 4 came out and all these Silver Age stuff, and Jack and Stan were getting in their groove with Fantastic, he wasn't reading any of that. Most of it he doesn't even know about. I think some of it's coincidental.
And also, I'm sure that's been in a bunch of science fiction, a guy's face in an explosion covered in bandages, and that's going back to like the Invisible Man or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, my father tells me, there's only like 7 original stories or something.
That's
like
right.
that.
That's probably right. Let's talk about ShieldMaster 3 and the Kickstarter surrounding that, and the new artwork, the new kind of story direction from ShieldMaster 3, and how can we support it?
It's almost a continuation of 1 and 2, where I'm introducing a new character, a mysterious character. You get introduced to him in #3. You find out a lot about him in #4. Not only are you building the 4 main characters, and they're starting to introduce some characters around, some supporting characters. The villain in Hillitron makes a comeback, which is a little bit of a spoiler, I guess, but there's that for you. You're going to read it, but by the end, you realize how everything connects. And then you read #4, then you realize how #3 really connects. As you get fed more information, you start seeing all the little links here and there. And so that's very exciting. And more than anything else, this isn't just a comic book. It is to a lot of people. And it's a way for me to work with my father. And that's really the drive behind it.
That's great.
It's a book, and, you have this property, but it's also a way that, as a kid growing up, I heard all these stories about my father working with my grandfather. that dynamic that they have. You know, my father said, well, the smiley face logo is not trademarked. You could use it. That shows up in press, Boss Smiley. Joe and my father, they work together. The comic book makers even more so. That was really a partnership. I just heard about that. And now I get to make adjacent memories with my father, just as he used to do with his father. Look, Joe's been gone 11 years now. You know, my father looks back on those memories and he cherishes those a lot. You know, there's a lot of ups and downs, father-son relationship, but you know, those never leave you. So, you know, that's what I really like to do. And you know, and I look at these books now and you know, it's a representation of a father and son relationship more than anything else. You know, granted though, I got to give you guys good stories and good artwork, you know, and it's a lot of fun working with a lot of these artists, you know, Bob Layden, David Mack, and Steve Butler,
It's cool.
you know, Butch Geis and Tom Morgan. You know, a lot of these guys are either people that knew Joe and, you know, look up to Joe, or it's people who wish that they met Joe and never got to, but now it's kind of their way of almost working a little bit with Joe. What I'm doing going forward is I mentioned those ShieldMaster sketches that are unfinished. Well, I'm going to have artists finish those sketches on Blue Line. So you'll get to see I'm in talk with a few artists, but for example, Joe and Tom Morgan together. Morgan has a very Romita-esque style to it. So, you know, you put that two together. But, you know, I'm in talks with some really big artists.
And is the Kickstarter live now for issue 3?
Yeah, it's live now. ShieldMaster is now a bi-monthly book. So it'll come out every other month. It runs until I believe July 3rd. And then the next one starts from August to about beginning of September. You know, we are a small publication. We use very high quality books and materials. It's a little more expensive. And then I'm doing a one-shot, which I'm very excited. I'm working with Joe Rubinstein. He has that famous Wolverine run with Frank Miller. And
he's inked the most characters from anybody.
But one thing I have to say I have is I believe I have an eye for talent. And that's something I got from Joe. He was very good at, and if you notice, all the people he worked with were very good.
That's right.
And Joe Rubinstein, he doesn't need me to say this, you know, and quite frankly, you know, who am I to say that he's good? But I remember years ago, before I started ShieldMaster, I saw him at a show. I looked at some of his art, didn't know who he was, didn't know his name. I looked at it, I said, geez, I said, this is great. I mean, just quick little doodles that he did. And more recently, I just started ShieldMaster. I was at a convention. He was there as well. And I got to see him work with a brush. And there's a lot of artists today that don't use brush anymore. But the way he handled it, I mean, it was so effortless. He was just fantastic. And so this one shot that I'm doing, I have him doing the cover. I'm working with him on it. I like to be involved. The cover is basically my take on Superman versus Muhammad Ali. I'm going to have ShieldMaster fighting ShieldMaster. You'll say, why is ShieldMaster fighting himself? Well, then I'll say, read the book. The people on the cover, I've swapped everybody out and I've put in celebrities. I put in Joe, Jack, Roz, Kirby. You know, I got permission from the Kirby family. He's very happy. They were excited about this. Ooh, Harrison Ford and Mick Jagger, and it'll be like a pop culture piece. But I'm also putting some superheroes on. Characters like a Fighting American and Stuntman. I got permission from the families to use them. A bunch of the Simon-Kirby characters, even the Fly, I got permission to use. And the Fly hasn't been around in 30-something years. So they'll be on the cover. It'll be great. You know, Joe just sent me an image earlier today. It's looking amazing. I got permission from, you know, Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee. Alan Moore said okay to being on my cover.
That's cool.
You know, he was excited about it. You know, the Romita said okay, and the Kuberts, you know, everybody's on board. So I'm very excited about that. So look for that. That'll be coming fall, end of the year. I said, well, what story could I write? I said, well, where did comic creators, comic characters, and celebrities appear? I said, a Comic-Con. So they go to Comic-Con. Some of them are going to have cameos inside the books, and you're going to find out why he's fighting himself.
A little on Joe now. Now, you've been a very strong advocate for your grandfather. You are now a Joe Simon historian, essentially, because you have all this great access to all this stuff, and you speak on his behalf. How old were you when you first realized that your grandfather was the first editor at Marvel? He was basically the first editor-in-chief. He helped establish the comics division for Martin Goodman. How old were you when you found that out?
He helped build a foundation to the company. I tell you, growing up, we'd call him Daddy Joe. We wouldn't call him Grandpa because he didn't want to feel old. And that started with the first cousin. You see, I'm the youngest. That was already tradition. And I grew up calling him Daddy Joe. And I go to his apartment, and this is one of the pieces that was up on his wall.
Right.
And I remember as a kid, I just look around at all this art, and I was always fascinated by it. And we just sit across from each other eating ice cream on a Saturday afternoon. And it's weird. We had a 90-year age gap. And for some reason, we understood each other.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, he would talk to me about things, and I have no idea what the hell he was saying. And I'm sure I was telling him things that he had no idea what I was saying. But there was a lot of moments where we just kind of seemed to be in sync. And I'm sure you've seen some of the photos that I'll post once in a while of Joe and myself. And if you look at the photos, there's a chemistry there that there's almost an understanding between one another. I have this photo of Joe at the drawing table, and he's drawing Captain America. And I'm standing playing with with the BB gun that he would use as reference. And it's a series of photos. And he's drawing, and then he looks up at me, and he sees what I'm doing. He laughs and he goes back to drawing. And then I put the gun down and I start looking at what he's doing, and I just become enamored with it. And I've always had that interest. And recently, I wondered, none of my cousins, none of the grandkids really care for the art and the comic books as much. I asked someone that was around when I was young at Joe's place. His name is Harry Mendrick. He did the art restoration scans on the Simon-Kirby library books for Titan. And I remember he'd be around all the time, just at the apartment, very quiet. I asked him one day, I said, were you surprised that I would be interested in this stuff where nobody else was? To my surprise, he said no, because he remembers me as a kid. I'd always ask what's going on with that, and I'd always be looking at the artwork. And I never thought about it that way, because I do remember looking at that piece in particular, identifying all the characters. And so from a young age, I cared about it.
Yeah.
From a young age, I knew that my grandfather was Joe Simon, creator of Captain America. And I remember being with him at Comic-Cons, fans lining up for hours just to shake his hand. But I don't think it quite clicked either.
Because you were kind of used to it, but then finally clicked one day.
Exactly. At the end of the day, he was my grandfather.
Basically, he created and drew the Captain America before bringing it to Kirby to make that first issue, right?
As I understand it, he pitched it to Goodman and did some art, just did a quick thing. Pitched it to Martin. Martin really liked it. From what I understand, Martin said that he wants to get this issue out fast. He was afraid that Hitler would be killed. And you cannot have a book on the stands or at the printer with a dead guy on the cover. Captain America, this new character that nobody knows, and he comes out, he's punching Hitler, and it's a dead guy. That'd be a sales nightmare. So it was my understanding that he wanted the book rushed. And from that's why Joe and Jack had to work so quickly. Joe got Al Gabriel and Al Avison, both from Connecticut. Lieberman came in, who was a friend of Joe's. I believe inked the first 3 pages. That book just, they banged it right out, and it was a huge seller. I mean, it really, I'd say in some ways, changed comics. It launched Simon and Kirby. It launched Timely to be a real contender.
It helped make Marvel the powerhouse that it was. It was the jumpstart it needed.
Exactly. I mean, don't get me wrong. Timely had some Mariner and the Human Torch.
Yeah. Marvel Comics 1 was pretty good.
Yeah, but it was nowhere near the level of Superman and Batman. I mean, when Captain America launched, then it was like, now.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then there was an article I saw that you and I both know about that I showed you. I posted in the Comic Book Historians Facebook group about how he joked that he created Stan Lee, basically. And you and I kind of had a chuckle at that because he was being sarcastic, but in a sense serious at the same time, because Stan was kind of working for him as kind of a gopher type of role as a teenager. And while Joe Simon was kind of the grown-up in the room, being the overseer of the comics division. But did he ever talk about those early days with Stan and kind of showing him the ropes and things?
You said kind of, how those were things, that was kind of what was going on. No, that's 100% what was going on. I mean, Stan was this kid that came in, and Joe hired him / was forced to hire him, and he just trained him. Don't get me wrong, Stan must have had it in him There's a video of Stan talking. I think it was, I don't remember if Joe was still alive or after. And Stan says, Joe taught him everything he knew. When you watch Joe work, now I can't say back in the 40s and 50s, I wasn't there, but I remember being a kid watching him work on Captain America drawings and all these other things. I mean, he was a machine. He'd do everything and he'd do it quick, and not as quick, he wasn't as fast of a penciler as Jack. That was something else. But Joe was quick, and he just, you just pick stuff up from him. And I remember as a kid, he'd lay out art paper for me. And by the time I was about 5 or 6, I was trying to do perspective just because I was around my grandfather. Now, did I have that in me? Well, someone might say so. But I'd say it's because I was around him, and he taught me. He said, he went crazy when he saw that. I drew 2 little mountains, one, big one up close and a small little upside down V far. And he just went insane when he started screaming. He was a very loud guy, at least, the later years. And he told me, he said, do you know what that is? That's perspective. And I said, no, I didn't know what that word meant. But, you picked up a lot from him. And if you look at, and even Jack Kirby, he said, there's nobody that knows comics better than Joe Simon. Joe could do everything. He could take it from a concept, do all the production, talk all the business, get it distributed around the country. He'd do every single step. So, you picked up a lot from him. And, I guess that's why he was able to work for so long.
Did he ever talk about working with the other Golden Age guys as well, like Al Avison and the rest? Did he ever give you any perspective on what kind of guys they were or anything like that? Did that ever come up?
As a kid, not so much. He wasn't talking to me about, all these other guys so much. That my father grew up around this, delivering pages to Craig Flessel, and was around Alfred Harvey and Jerry Grandinetti and all these other guys. He remembers Jack, sitting in the studio watching Joe and Jack draw fly pages and the Fighting American stuff and make this stuff come to life. I mean, he was there for all that. What I do remember is people like Carmine Infantino just being at the apartment, and I'd run right by Carmine as Joe had this big poofy recliner in the middle of the living room. And Carmen would sit where Joe had a little tabaret and where he would eat his breakfast once in a while. And I just run past Carmine and some of these other guys. And that's where they would be talking about the old guys and, look at what this guy is doing and just stuff like that.
So for Lancelot Strong and Fighting American, was it said to you that he basically originated those characters and developed them with Jack Kirby, or did they kind of develop the second 2 characters together?
My understanding is Joe got wind that Cap was being brought back at Timely. They changed it to Atlas. He was pretty pissed about it. So he told Jack, he said, let's do our own Captain America. And they did Fighting American together, which started out very serious, then became, a comedy book. Now, as for Private Strong, John Goldwater from MLJ Comics called up Joe. And Joe and Jack had kind of split and gone off and, did their own thing. Jack was doing work at what was Marvel then. I believe they changed the name in 58, 59. Maybe it was still Atlas.
It wasn't either at that time. Marvel is kind of like 53, and then Atlas kind of ends at 57. So it had this weird in-between point.
Yeah.
Where it didn't have either name. Just Goodman Comics, I guess.
Yeah, so Jack was doing work there, and Joe was doing work at kind of Harvey. Goldwater calls and said, Joe, we want you to do a superhero line. And Joe said, okay. They said, well, what do you want to do? And Joe said, well, I'll do my version of the Shield, call it Double Life of Private Strong. And I want to do a character called either Spiderman or Silver Spider. I don't know which name he was going by. I think he was going by Silver Spider by that point.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, we just want you to do something. And then, then he met Jack and, the comics were made, but Joe was working with Jack Oleck, his brother-in-law. Many people don't know that they were actually related. Working with C.C. Beck, who wanted to come out of retirement. Just the stuff that they did was really good. Jack wasn't only working on the fly. You had people like Bob Powell and Angelo Torres working for Joe as well. But, you also have to understand in 1959, the dynamic was no longer the same as 1955. This was a point where Joe and Jack, I wouldn't say that they were really partners, though they had their dynamic, and that will always be there because they just got each other. Their business relationship status was no longer the same. I mean, Joe was working at Archie, and the people were all under him, including Jack. Whereas it used to be Joe and Jack together, and the people were under them. Now Jack was working for Joe. Same situation as Bob Powell, Angelo Torres.
Yeah, because Jack was doing other stuff too. He was doing some Marvel stuff.
He wasn't at just one place.
He's just working where the work was.
Correct.
To your knowledge, what was the nature of their breakup in 55? You know, they were doing the mainline thing, and the comics code was happening, and that was kind of decimating distribution and whatnot. Other than financial hardship from the comics code, what was the nature of that breakup?
In 1955, you know, they wanted mainline to be big. And I think if they had done mainline 5 years earlier, it could have weathered the storm.
Right.
I believe that for sure. And I believe to some degree, if they'd done 5 years later, you know, they would have had a decent chance of surviving as well. The whole mainline debacle, and then you had the Senate hearings. It was just such a large storm. Joe was kind of sick of it. He didn't see a future in comics. So he wanted to do something else. And you know, he did some advertising work. He did Sick Magazine. He kind of started to separate himself from comics. Jack, to some degree, too. He started doing newspaper strips, you know, Sky Masters, this and that. Joe still dabbled in comics, and Jack reverted back to comics very heavily. You know, it's just two guys. They were working together for 15 years. They raised their families together. I guess it was kind of time to just go their own way. They had different ambitions. You know, things changed. I don't know if they had a big fight after mainline or what. And there were some times that they did have a little argument here or there. But and some people, they want to pin Joe against Jack and you know, say that they were rivals and one did the other one dirty. And there were moments that, you know, that I'm sure if they could go back in time, if they were still here, that they regret maybe their action, or, you know. But what people fail to understand is these two guys really cared for each other at the end of the day. They're like brothers. You have a brother, you fight. You don't speak for you know, depending on your family relationship, you don't speak for anywhere from, you know, a week to 3 years. But you still have that love for your brother. And that's with them. I mean, you know, some people make out at the end Joe and Jack, you know, had this huge falling out. They wouldn't speak with you. And that's not true. I mean, they'd call each other up and talk. And even after Jack passed, you know, Joe would take care of Roz and, you know, call her on Mother's Day and wish her happy Mother's Day. I mean, they when Rob Liefeld was doing Fighting American, well, wanted to do Fighting American, he went to Roz because he didn't know Joe. And Roz says, you know, you got to go to Joe. You know, he handles everything. You know, if they had this giant falling out, believe me, Roz would not say, go to this guy that we have a huge problem with to do business.
Yeah, a lot of people want to sensationalize things. It sounds like they're just going their separate ways and they work together for a long time. Sometimes people just have to do something different.
Like I said, it's like two brothers who really care for each other, that, you know, sometimes you have an argument here or there, you know. It's
he had a relationship with Al Harvey, and that turned into a long association.
Oh yeah.
What was the nature of that friendship as far as meeting and developing a long professional relationship and personal relationship with each other?
Alfred, they all met at Fox Comics. Joe, Jack, Alfred. And Alfred was the one that kind of introduced Joe and Jack together. And you know, Joe and Jack, they just hit it off. But and Joe and Alfred always remained close. When Alfred was starting Harvey Comics, he offered Joe 50% for $300. And, you know, $300, you know, today you say, you know, that's a no-brainer. But back then, $300 is, you know, another false thing that people say about Joe is that Joe grew up rich. You know, that's not true. You know, it's Joe was just as poor as Jack, if not poorer. I mean, you know, they at one point he didn't have a home. You know, his family was couch surfing from friend to friend, and so that was a lot of money to him. But he said, you know, Alfred, I can't do the $300, but what I'll do is I'll do some covers for you for free, help you save on expenses. So some of those speed covers, a pocket comic covers.
He's almost drawing like Lou Fine in some of those.
Exactly. Which Joe was. Which the problem with identifying some of Joe's art is that he was such a good ghost artist that he would mask himself. I mean, Wonderworld 13, for example, is one of his most famous covers. I'd say his most famous Fox cover. And people to this day are still, you know, saying, oh, I don't think that's Joe. That's not Joe. He signed the damn thing, you know, really small. He was that good. Don't get me wrong. There was times that he was phoning it in, that the work is, you know, you say, geez, you know, that's the same guy. Don't get me wrong, but that's the thing with Joe. When Joe was great, he was just fantastic. And when Joe wasn't so great, you want to turn a blind eye. And I'll be the first one to admit it, even as his family member. But Alfred, so Joe always felt like he had a home at Harvey Comics, and he did. He needed some work, you go to Alfred. It's they helped each other out. And when Alfred was having problems, well, there was Joe to help out. And when Joe was having, financial problems or even family problems after his wife passed away, Alfred was right there to help him. And even when Alfred, wasn't doing so well himself, physically, and Joe was there to help. That's how they were. It wasn't just strictly business. And same thing with Jack as well. A lot of people fail to realize that these guys were human. They had their personal relations with each other. They have a heart. Not everything is, this comic sold bad. I'm done with you. It's you've been screwing me over. No, it's not like that.
You'd mentioned Jack Oleck working with Joe, and that it was his brother-in-law.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there was a certain mixture of blood and business and friendship, and that it was kind of there were connections that went beyond just pure professional.
I mean, you look at Stanley, and you look at his uncle by marriage, Martin Goodman, founder of Marvel, the Timely. Joe married Joe married Harriet Feldman, and Jack Oleck married Harriet's sister.
Oh, okay. So that's that connection.
Jack and Oleck were not blood, but married into the same family.
Yeah, by marriage. A lot of these connections are by marriage.
Harriet was Alfred's assistant, secretary. That's how you met her at Harvey Comics.
Oh, that's how. Okay.
There's a lot of history
through women, it sounds like, which is interesting. So then now Jack Oleck, who you mentioned, he also you had mentioned to me that he had fought in World War II with General Patton, and he was also like a script writer. Like, he was writing scripts and was a really good writer. He's actually been published himself in the writing world.
Correct.
And that he did a lot of the script writing for Simon and Kirby. What's your awareness of Jack Oleck and his relationship with Joe Simon and him as a guy in general?
So Jack Oleck, he was one of DC's big writers. He wrote a lot of those House of Mysteries and what's that other title? House of Mystery and House of Secrets.
Yeah.
And if you look at the new Sandman show, the Game and Sandman TV on Netflix, special thanks, it's Jack Oleck on a lot of those episodes. Jack wrote a lot for Simon and Kirby, but he also lifted a lot of those stories from Simon and Kirby. He took Joe's omnibus bound volume of comics of the Black Magics, and he wrote notes and all the, he lifted stories from those and wrote them and elaborated them into those DC stories. So, it's a lot of back and forth, whenever Joe needed somebody to, if he couldn't write something, he'd call up Jack and say, hey, do this for me. And it wasn't as formal as everyone thinks. It's definitely not as formal as it is today. Today you have contracts,
right,
business agreements, you got to call somebody up and you got to agree on payment. Back then it was like, do this for me. It's like, sure.
I love Kirby and Ditko. I'm in that school, and
of course, who isn't?
But I noticed in the Simon and Kirby team, what seems to happen is a lot of the art credits get diverted to Kirby for the most part. And I've even seen some people falsely put Jack Oleck's dialogue onto Kirby as well. And it's weird. It's almost like it, and I know he was a creative machine and he was a powerhouse, and I get all that, but it just seems like sometimes some people have a hard time. There's almost this urge to like divert Jack Oleck's scripts and Joe Simon's layouts or art and give it all to Kirby.
People realize that Jack was great, and it took some people a long time. I'm not going to say everybody, but it took a lot of people a long time to realize how great Jack was. Joe was not shy by saying how great Jack was. He was great. You look at his stuff, it's great. That's the best way you could put it. And the guy was very fast. The guy was very creative. He was a machine, but he was not a god. There's no way he did every single little damn thing. There's no way. There's other people involved. Sometimes there were things that Jack did on his own completely. For that, he gets all the credit. Why not? He did all the work. But there's other things that, if Joe inked it, they still somehow doubt that Joe inked it. I mean, they want to say, they put a Joe's and they put a question mark in his name. It's they're so certain about giving Jack his due that sometimes they forget about everybody else, which in my opinion is not right. I guess I'm a little more close to it, being the fact that I'm related to the guy. But, and like I said, Jack should get his credit for sure. If he did everything, he should get all the credit. And there are some things that Jack did everything to, which he should get all the credit. But there are some things that he did not. Like, look at Vagabond Prince and Duke of Broadway and Kid Adonis. That was all Joe. I mean, I think Jack on one splash page drew two heads on a Duke of Broadway splash page, two little heads. Jack didn't get a lot of credit for his Marvel work and all these other things. So, you can't take away credit from others either, or not give them their credit. That's how I see it.
No, I agree. Now, any cool stories about Mort Meskin? You hear anything much about him?
Mort came out of kind of I guess, how do I say it? It's almost like a hospital kind of. And he needed work, and he went to Joe and Jack's studio, and they gave him, they said, okay, yeah, sure. You're a very good artist. Mort was very talented. And but he sat there for, I think, like a day or two, and he couldn't draw.
He needed someone to just draw a dot so he can continue the picture. Just such a unique, strange story for someone so talented at drawing. So,
I can't say for everyone, but sometimes you just need a little push. It's like you have so many. I think this is what happened. I think he just had so many ideas. And Mort was very fast at drawing too. He was, I guess you compare him to Jack. They're both very fast. And Mort was very talented. I mean, you look at his stuff on Boys Ranch, you look at his stuff, everywhere else. It's just, he was just great. I mean, Joe and Jack were very fortunate. They had a lot of talented guys that came through them. Part of it was luck for sure. And part of it was, these guys, they wanted to go with the top dogs, and Joe and Jack were the top dogs. So, a lot of them went through, Ditko, Adams, Stranko, all these people, the Stan, Carmine, Giacoya, all those went through Joe and Jack together. I mean, it's amazing.
Joe and Jack defined romance comics, and that's an interesting thing in 1947, 46. And then they also worked on a variety of genres, not just superhero. They did crime stories, they did horror stories. What was it about the chemistry between them that they were able to pioneer all sorts of genres? Is your impression that they were kind of bouncing ideas back and forth and kind of vibing and synergizing together? Like, what is that your impression of all that?
Well, I'll tell you from what I understand. What I understand is if you look at their work through every genre, romance, crime, horror, and what they wanted was dynamic storytelling. Some of the stories were phoned in, whatever, but it was always an interesting idea and definitely artwork. And they had their standards. They always had that quality work to them. With what my friend tells me, sitting there watching them draw those bullseye pages and the Finding America pages, two of them were like yin and yang with each other. Jack might come up with an idea and start doing something. And then Joe sees what he's doing and embraces part of it and redoes part of it. And Jack doesn't even realize that Joe changed that little thing. Same thing with Joe. Joe could be doing something. Jack takes a look and, they just got each other. And when my father would tell me that, I didn't really understand what he meant by that. I said, how could two people almost be in sync and build off of each other in a way that it's still, the same concept? And I didn't know exactly what he was talking. I couldn't envision it. And then when I started doing ShieldMaster, and he would come to me with an idea, and I would listen and I would build off of his, but add something to it and keep it somewhat the same.
Yeah.
Then only did I realize, well, that's what Joe and Jack must have been kind of like.
Yeah, that's the collaboration.
That's exactly, and Captain America originated with Joe, but would Captain America be what it is today? Would the first 10 issues have been the way they were without Jack? I'd be the first one to say no. And just like how I'd say, without Joe, the first 10 issues would not be the way they were as well. Without one another, during the same time that they were working together, this stuff is not the same. Some might be closer than others, but it's never quite the same. When Jack was doing stuff, when he got back from the war, and he was doing stuff and signed at Simon-Kirby. It looks a little off. And when Joe was in the Coast Guard and he did the Boy Commandos number 12 cover without Jack, signed at Simon-Kirby, you could tell, at least I can tell it's a little off. It's not quite the two of them. That's pretty unique.
I had read somewhere that he got involved in politics in the late 50s after he phased out of comics. Is that right, or is that not right?
He worked on the, was it Norman Rockefeller? He became governor or something of New York. Yeah, he worked on he did some political pamphlets for him.
Okay.
He did do stuff here and there. He did some work for banks, doing advertisements. Joe was just like how Joe and Jack were all over the place with comics. Same, and even Jack without Joe was all over the place with different companies. It's not, I'd say, not quite as all over the place as Joe, but it's the same thing. Joe was all over the place. I mean, doing things here, there.
I like that Rockefeller reference. That's pretty cool. How did he get into the humor genre with Sick Magazine?
Joe always had a sense of humor. And if you knew Joe, his humor was, dare I say, a little weird. I mean, it was kind of dry, but he was a very funny guy. I mean, he'd always make you laugh. I mean, he never left the room without laughing at least once. I mean, I have photos with him. I mean, he'd do nothing, and somehow I'd just be laughing. He just had to make you laugh.
That's cool.
He was parroting things, making fun of things. Always had his, unique, twisted view on things, whether, better or worse. But Teddy Epstein saw the sales records to Mad Magazine. He said, wow, this thing is selling like hotcakes. He said, Joe, why don't we do something? Joe said, okay. Did Sick Magazine. And he got his buddies together. He got Bob Powell together. He got, he had Angelo Torres for some. He had Jack Davis for some of that stuff. I mean, you can't get better than Davis.
Yeah, that's right.
And Joe always said Davis was to cartooning what Jack Kirby was to comics. Those two guys were like, the top. Sick Magazine, I tell you. Did it sell as well as Mad? No. But it was the second competitor.
Now, do you guys own Sick Magazine? Do you guys own that trademark and copyright?
Yeah, we've talked to a few publishers about reprinting, like the best of Sick Magazine or doing something with it. My father and I would love to see something with it. We're in talks with a few, but we'd like to see something. I mean, there's really fantastic artwork. I mean, Joe even did a parody of Stan Lee called Sam Me.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Which I will somewhat be bringing back slightly in a way. Have something to do with ShieldMaster.
Oh, really? That's cool. That's fun. What's your awareness of him working with Jack again on Sandman in DC in the early 70s? What's your awareness of that situation?
So my understanding of Sandman and DC was Carmine really wanted to reunite Joe and Jack. I mean, don't forget, Carmine was a kid who went to Time League Comics. And there was Joe and Jack. And Joe gave him his first work. So as a kid, he read Simon-Kirby. He loved Simon-Kirby. He grew up working the Simon, he did a few assignments in Simon-Kirby studio, doing some Charlie Chan art. So he always, idolized, there's a few figures in comics that you have to idolize, even if you didn't grow up reading their work. I mean, Siegel, Schuster, Kane, Finger, I had thrown Robinson, Simon-Kirby. Those are really the core, I'd say, from the golden age. And Lou Fine, and there's a few I haven't mentioned. My understanding is he went to Joe. And he said, Joe, come up with something. Joe said, what am I going to do? He did Brother Parrot the Geek. And my father suggested, well, what about that song called Sandman? He comes in your dreams. And Joe said, well, I already did a Sandman. I already did our version of Sandman in the 40s. But my father said, well, you could do a different one so that's what he suggested. And Carmine said, okay. Joe was working with Jerry Graninetti heavily at the time. Jack said he'd agreed to do it, and they did the work. I mean, Jerry did the sketch to the first cover. Joe gave Jerry's sketch, sent it to Jack. Jack was down on the West Coast. It was a little different, where they used to be in each other's houses. And Joe did the cover. Jack and Royer did the interior. Joe scripted it, which was weird for Joe. Because if he wasn't drawing the interior, he'd like to, oversee it or, come in and, spot some black in or whatever, And that's what they did. And going forward, and it sold very well. It was a number one. So, those tend to sell better. And as I understand it, there was a big storm or something like that. So, they couldn't get the new comics to the stands. So, it's repeat business or new business. Jack asked Carmine that he really wanted to do it on his own. He was tired of being associated as a team with other people. Just left Stan, for 15 years with Joe. So Jack said, he wants to do it on his own. And Jack said, fine, if that's what Jack wants, let him do it on his own. And was Joe hurt by that? I can't say. I think so a little. He kind of thought that, getting the gang back together. And but Jack wanted to do it on his own, okay. And that's what they did.
There's also this whole thing of Spider-Man, right? You mentioned Oleck and CC Beck and the Silver Spider thing.
Yeah.
But there's also this whole discussion of where Spider-Man came from. And in the early 90s, Joe Simon, talked, I think they had an earlier version of Comic Book Makers and a newer one with Vanguard later, but
correct.
And Greg Theakson released stuff about Spider-Man's origins. But a lot of it, as a lot of people don't know, but probably should know, is that the name kind of originated more with the Joe Simon team and him and Oleck and CC Beck trying to make maybe Spider-Man, then they changed the name to Silver Spider, but the name kind of hung on.
Yeah.
And I think the idea is that Jack Kirby brought that name over to Stan, which then later became the Spider-Man we know through Ditko. It was like a hot potato that never quite settled anywhere until it settled at Marvel, but that it's kind of starts with Joe Simon in a way.
Yeah, in 1953, Joe has the idea for Spider-Man, one word. And he has CC Beck wants to come out of retirement. He says, Joe, he goes to Joe, call up your friend and said, got anything for me? And Joe said, okay, yeah, I'm thinking about doing this character called Spider-Man. He said, okay. Joe pitched it around to Harvey. Leon Harvey, Alfred's twin, basically writes this whole thing. This is no good. People don't like spiders, blah, blah. It's no good. Anyways, Joe leaves it with the Harveys, and Alfred would save everything in the Harvey warehouse. I mean, that place was like a treasure trove. Then when Goldwater calls up Joe, he goes back to the Harvey warehouse, takes that arc, because Joe and Jack, at least when they were together, they'll save it on the shelf. 5 years later, they'll use it. 3 months later, they'll use it. They'd get to it. So Joe takes that, changes the name to Silver Spider from Spider-Man. And he said, sure, do whatever. Joe meets Jack at Central Park. Jack had just lost that case with Jack Schiff regarding Sky Masters. Jack needed work. And Joe said, well, why don't you come work for me? I'm doing some things at Archie. And Jack said, okay. And he took a look at what they were doing. And again, they got right back into their little groove. As I understand it, Joe lettered Spider-Man in a very unique way on a board, the CC Beck art, and Jack took that home with him to work on it. And in the 60s, Stan was looking for new ideas. Stan said, what about Spider-Man? Draws it. Stan says, no good, too bulky. Brings it to Ditko. Steve says, well, you can't do this. This is just the Fly without, the Fly aspect. The rest is, Tommy, Troy, T.E.T. Peter Parker, one's an orphan. The other one doesn't have parents either. It's very similar, both that bug aspects. They can't do that. So Stan and Steve developed it into the Spider-Man we know today. Joe did not know that Jack brought the art that he gave him and his logo and his name to Stan. He didn't know that he gave it to him. Jack didn't ask for permission or anything. And I guess, back then it wasn't that big of a deal. But I always imagine Joe walking down, the street, seeing the newsstand Spider-Man and saying, well, what the hell, did I have a character kind of like that? So, I always imagine that. But then later, back in the 80s, Jack calls up Joe and he apologizes for giving it to Stan. And he sends Joe his logo back, and it's in the Comic Book Makers. And as for the Silver Spider pages, Jack had those as well. He gave to, as I understand, he gave to Greg Theakston to give to Joe because Greg knew Jack and Joe. And one thing with Greg is that, I think it's pretty common knowledge that Greg actually stole some art from Jack. And that artwork never made it back to Joe. Greg sold the artwork when he was supposed to give it to Joe. So Joe never got that back. It's very complicated. Now, the Spider-Man today is not Simon and Kirby's. Not Simon's, not Kirby's, not Simon and Kirby, for sure. No one's saying that. But I'm inclined to say without Simon and Kirby, I don't think the Spider-Man would exist today. Or if it does, it'd be different.
Yeah.
I think that little thing in front of them triggered them to build upon it.
Sure.
It gave that launching pad. I don't think that they would have come up. Now, I've also heard that Stan was a very big fan of a pulp called The Spider. Maybe he would have come up, it's a who knows.
But there's certainly a factor, an ingredient from Joe Simon for sure. And I think the same goes with the Fantastic Four. not from the Fantastic Four, but the initial team of four, the Challengers of the Unknown, which, from what I understand, was a Joe Simon concept. Is that right?
No, it was a Simon and Kirby concept from Mainline. If you look at the first appearance, as I understand it, they did a few pages, like 2-3 pages of art. And if you look at the Showcase #6 comic, and there was 2 splash pages in particular that really look Simon and Kirby like. Jack without Joe was close, a little something that was off. And if you look at it, it really looks Simon and Kirby like. If you're very familiar with the Simon and Kirby stuff, and that's what I look at almost all the time, is Simon and Kirby work. It looks really like it. It's where they're introducing all the characters, and it looks like they just took that directly from the Boy Commandos, where they're introducing them, as well as the Boys Ranch. It's just like that, and it's very Simon and Kirby like. Did Jack develop the concept after he started working on it at DC? I wasn't there. I maybe the initial concept was together at Mainline,
which is interesting because Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four are so critical to the formation of the Marvel Universe.
Oh, yeah.
And then Joe Simon was the editor-in-chief that started the comics division there. And those kind of Simon-related nuggets kind of trigger explosions that are what they are at Marvel now. So it's clearly something that, none of us should ever forget.
Yeah, Joe's, very much, almost like behind the scenes in a way. Jack as well. Jack was also very instrumental in the front, but also, some of that stuff, he worked on the Simon and Kirby stuff. But also, you look at Hawkeye, Joe and Jack had their bullseye, that's very similar. It's just both a guy with the bow and arrow that doesn't miss. Okay. Joe and Jack did Thor back in the 40s, the villain from Valhalla, but it's Thor. Granted, you take that from Norse mythology, but they had it. You start looking at it, the more you like it, the more you find some things. And I wouldn't be surprised if Jack reused ideas, Stan reused ideas, Joe reused ideas. Everybody did.
Everyone did, yeah.
It's very interesting to see how Joe does have some connection to a lot of those things. And that's why I say, if Mainline was done 5 years before and it weathered the storm, Martin would have gone out of business. Ditko and all these other guys knew Joe and Jack.
Yeah, it'd be a whole nother landscape.
They would have had their version, possibly, of Marvel Comics. Now, granted, Joe being in charge might have shot a lot of the ideas down. It's possible. They might not have developed the way they were. Stan was very important to that as well. As you can't take Simon or Kirby out of the formula. You can't take Stan, Steve, Jack, Don Heck, all those guys, Lieber, Larry. You can't take any of those guys out. It doesn't quite, It's interesting to think if Joe and Jack had weathered the storm, Marvel never really formed. If they had inherited all those guys, who knows what it'd be like today?
Who knows?
Maybe I'd be in Beverly Hills,
Any final remarks on ShieldMaster that everybody should know about?
ShieldMaster, it's a lot more than just a comic. This is a book that's has 3 generations behind it. It's something really unique. And what I treasure most about ShieldMaster is I get both sides. I get not only go to Comic-Cons, people meet me, say how much they enjoy this story and like the character, want to know what's coming next, and they like to ask me about Joe and that stuff too. So that's very nice and rewarding. But the other thing is all the behind the scenes, and it's a lot of work and a lot of stress, to put the book together and deal with all these moving parts. But I get to work with my father and run into his room at 10 in the morning or 10 at night, and just tell him about my new idea. And at times he tells me to go away, and other times, he wants to hear and he builds upon my idea. And sometimes I'll shoot it down, and sometimes he'll shoot my idea down. But then there's these moments that we really just build upon each other's ideas, and the product is one of father and son, and that's what I really enjoy, and that's something really unique. So when you look at it, it's not just a superhero book with an interesting story. It's a lot more than that. And so I hope that everyone would go take a look at it. We have ShieldMaster #3 is out now on Kickstarter. Also, you can get the copies to #1 and 2 on it if you want to join us starting now. Better to get in now than later. And so it's as we expand, prices will likely come down as the book gets wider. We're doing lots of exciting things like the one shot. And thank you.
definitely have your grandpa's gleam in your eye, because you have a great way of describing that, getting me all excited about it. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that. And I appreciate our conversation and finally having a face-to-face. And I wanted to thank you sincerely for being a guest on the Comic Book Historians podcast. I really enjoyed having you here. Thank you so much.
No problem.